The BBC is once again facing accusations of political bias, this time over a misedited clip of Donald Trump that made his speech sound more extreme than it actually was. The edit sparked outrage, led to 2 senior resignations, and reignited a wider debate over whether the BBC is institutionally biased. The claims stem from a memo written by Michael Prescott, a former advisor to the BBC's Editorial Standards Committee. In it, he accused the corporation of selectively editing Trump's speech, allowing bias within BBC Arabic, and being captured by activists on gender issues. The memo was passed to The Telegraph, which published it, fueling a media storm and prompting renewed attacks from right-wing politicians and commentators, who say the scandal proves that the BBC is dominated by liberal ideology. However, others inside and outside the BBC argue that these claims are exaggerated, that while mistakes were made, they don't amount to systemic left-wing bias. So once again, the same question returns. Is the BBC institutionally biased, and if so, in which direction? Firstly, let's look at the accusations of bias in more detail. Prescott's memo has reignited accusations mainly from the right that the BBC is institutionally biased towards the left. And it's not the first time, because for years the right has claimed that the BBC is too woke, too liberal, and out of touch. For example, during Brexit, Nigel Farage and dozens of Conservative MPs accuse it of pro-Remain bias, arguing it gave more airtime and credibility to Remain campaigners. Others, from Boris Johnson to The Telegraph, say it promotes progressive social values on race, gender and migration, reflecting a London-centric liberal elite. And newspapers like The Times and the Daily Mail have accused it of showing liberal bias on immigration and identity, claiming it sides with activists over ordinary Britons. So, to many on the right, Prescott's memo is simply the latest proof of a pattern they've long believed. However, whilst many inside BBC acknowledge some genuine editorial errors, they have strongly rejected claims of systemic left-wing bias. And on the flip side, there are also many accusations from the left who argue the opposite, that the BBC is biased towards the right. They point to coverage of Israel-Gaza, where critics say that the BBC's language and framing show a clear pro-Israel slant. Or, back during the Corbyn era, they argued that the BBC gave disproportionately negative coverage of his leadership compared to other politicians, and more recently, they've criticised the BBC's decision to give disproportionately more airtime to reform voices and policies than to Greens or Liberal Democrats. So there are accusations of bias on both sides, and that isn't surprising, because some bias is inevitable in any newsroom, and so you will definitely find examples to support either case. The real question is, are these examples a reflection of systemic and institutional bias, or are they simply selective cases that confirm our assumptions? In other words, does the perception that the BBC is institutionally biased match the reality? The only way to answer that is to look at the hard data, the findings of long-term academic studies that have been analysing the BBC's reporting, and ask what the overall pattern really shows. We can't take a look at every study, but we can take a look at the most comprehensive ones, studies that have taken place over a number of years by dedicated academics and researchers, and see what their conclusions are. The first major study comes from Cardiff University, called the Hard Evidence Project. It analysed thousands of BBC reports across politics, economics and foreign affairs. What they found was that the BBC overwhelmingly relies on official and elite sources, government ministers, business leaders and military figures, whilst giving far less space to unions, NGOs or grassroots voices. When it came to the economy, coverage tends to reflect pro-market and fiscally conservative assumptions, echoing the Treasury and the City of London. And so the researchers concluded that BBC journalism generally mirrors the worldview of Britain's political and business establishment. Not deliberate left or right-wing bias, but a structural one shaped by power and access. Another major study analysed the BBC's coverage of Jeremy Corbyn during his leadership of the Labour Party. The study, produced by the Media Reform Coalition in collaboration with Birkbeck University of London, analysed 465 online news items from 8 different providers, along with 40 primetime television news bulletins from the BBC and ITV. Their research found that the BBC gave twice as much airtime to critical rather than supportive voices of Jeremy Corbyn as compared to ITV, which was generally more balanced. The researchers also noted the highly negative language BBC reporters used to describe Jeremy Corbyn, his team and his supporters. According to Tom Mills, a lecturer in sociology at Aston University and author of a book on the BBC, these findings reflect the BBC's deeper role as a pro-establishment institution that defends elite interests and is instinctively defensive of the political status quo. And the third major piece of research on the BBC came from the Glasgow Media Group, best known for its book Bad News from Israel. Their long-term studies of the BBC's coverage of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict found that it disproportionately amplified Israeli voices, framed Israeli violence as retaliation, gave greater emotional weight to Israeli casualties, and largely ignored the historical context of occupation, overall creating a narrative that implicitly blamed Palestinians for the conflict. These findings lend further weight to the argument that the BBC's coverage aligns with the views of political elites and the British government, which historically has been broadly supportive of Israel. Taken together, these studies paint a consistent picture. There's no solid evidence of a left-wing or woke agenda within the BBC, but there is clear long-term evidence of establishment bias. In other words, deference to power, reliance on elite voices, and avoidance of perspectives that challenge the status quo. And because that establishment, from Parliament and Whitehall to the press, civil service, and business sector, has historically leaned conservative, that institutional bias inevitably leans that way as well. In short, the BBC isn't ideologically left or right, but its structural alignment with a broadly conservative establishment means that the left's criticism of right-leaning bias is better supported by the evidence. So, coming back to the main question, is the BBC institutionally biased? The answer is yes, but not in the way that most people think. It's not a left-wing organisation pushing progressive ideology, but it's not necessarily a right-wing mouthpiece for the government either. In reality, it's an upwards establishment bias rather than a left-right ideological one. And there are a number of reasons for this bias, mainly to do with how it's funded, structured and staffed. For example, it relies on government approval for its licence fee, and it draws leadership and journalists from the same social circles as political and corporate elites. Now, to be clear, this doesn't necessarily mean that the BBC is deliberately biased. What it means is that its journalism reflects the worldview of the institutions that it depends on and the establishment culture it operates within. And it also doesn't necessarily mean that every BBC journalist reflects this establishment thinking. There are plenty of reporters who challenge power and do extraordinary work. The BBC's journalism can be excellent, and it does remain one of the most trusted broadcasters in the world. But, as with any media organisation, that trust should never mean blind faith, and we should always be aware of what its fundamental nature truly is: a mirror of the establishment.